The rain had finally stopped, but Maria Delgado's tears hadn't. She stood in her tiny kitchen, staring at the official-looking paper in her hand. The words "Evitation no tai si, 72 HRUS" seemed to jump off the page and punch her in the stomach. "Mama, what's wrong?" 6-year-old Elena appeared in the doorway, her dark curls still messy from sleep, clutching her worn teddy bear. Maria quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Aren't you hungry? Let's have some breakfast." Maria opened the refrigerator door and her heart sank. A half-empty carton of milk, 2 eggs, and some nearly stale bread. It would have to do. As Elena ate, Maria sat at their small table, her mind racing. 3 months without steady work had drained what little savings she had. The textile factory where she'd worked for 5 years had shut down without warning. Every day since then, she'd gone door to door, business to business, asking for work. Any work. "Unfinished, Mama," Elena said, pushing her plate away. "Can I watch cartoons?" "Just for a little while, mi vida. Then we need to talk about something important." As Elena settled in front of their old TV, Maria retreated to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her bed. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Her sister in Arizona was struggling with her own 3 children. Her parents had passed away years ago. Friends had already lent what they could, and Maria couldn't bear to ask again. Her eyes fell on her father's guitar, propped in the corner of the room. It was the one thing she couldn't bring herself to pawn, despite everything. Her father had taught her to play when she was barely older than Elena, and music had always been their special connection. After he died, playing those old songs was how she kept him close. Maria picked up the guitar, her fingers automatically finding the familiar chords of a lullaby her father used to sing. She hadn't played in months. What was the point of music when you were drowning? But now, as the gentle notes filled the quiet room, something shifted inside her. An idea took shape. A desperate, terrifying idea. That afternoon, Maria sat Elena down and explained as gently as she could that they needed to leave their apartment. "We're going on an adventure," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll find a new place to live. What about my school? What about my friends?" Elena's bottom lip trembled. "You'll stay at the same school," Maria promised, praying she could keep that promise. "And you'll see your friends. But things will be a little different for a while." They packed what they could carry: clothes, Elena's school books, a few treasured photos, and of course the guitar. Maria left their keys with the sympathetic neighbor who promised to tell the landlord they were gone. By sunset, Maria and Elena stood on a busy downtown street corner. The evening crowd was just beginning to emerge from office buildings, heading to restaurants or home to their families. Maria had chosen this spot carefully, near enough to the theater district to catch people in good spirits, but not so close that official performers would chase her away. "Are we going to sing, Mama?" Elena asked, looking confused as Maria took out the guitar. "I am, Major. You're going to sit on this blanket and do your homework. Remember what we talked about? This is my new job until I find another one." Maria's hands shook as she tuned the guitar. She had never done anything like this before. What if nobody stopped? What if they were chased away? What if it wasn't enough? Taking a deep breath, she began to play a popular song that she knew many would recognize. Her voice, unused to projecting over street noise, started soft and uncertain. A few people glanced her way but continued walking. Elena watched her mother with wide eyes. Then something shifted. Maria closed her eyes and let the music take her, the way her father had taught her. Her voice grew stronger, richer, filling the evening air with emotion that transcended language. A man stopped, then a couple, then a small group. As the song ended, a smattering of applause broke out, and a few coins and bills landed in the open guitar case. Elena beamed up at her mother with pure pride. For the first time in months, Maria felt a tiny spark of hope. They might just make it after all. The alarm on Maria's phone buzzed at 5:30 a.m. She reached over quickly to silence it before it woke Elena, who was curled up beside her on the narrow motel bed. The room was small and smelled of old cigarettes despite the no smoking sign on the door, but at $40 a night, it was all they could afford. Maria slipped out of bed carefully. Even after 3 weeks of their new routine, she still wasn't used to these early mornings. Her body ached from standing for hours the day before, and her throat felt scratchy. She couldn't afford to get sick. Not now. In the tiny bathroom, Maria splashed cold water on her face and studied her reflection. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her cheeks looked hollower than before. She forced a smile, practicing the expression she would wear all day no matter how tired she felt. People were more generous when she smiled. By 6:15, she had gently woken Elena and helped her dress for school. "Can I have cereal today, Mama?" Elena asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Maria's heart sank. The small box of cereal she bought 3 days ago was empty. "Not today, Maija. But look what I have." She pulled out a slightly bruised apple and a granola bar she'd been saving. A special breakfast. Elena didn't complain, and that almost hurt worse than if she had. At 7 years old, her daughter was already learning to expect less, to be grateful for whatever came her way. Maria promised herself that someday things would be different. They left the motel together, walking the 12 blocks to Elena's school. Maria carried her guitar case in one hand and held Elena's small hand in the other. The morning air was crisp, autumn clearly giving way to winter. Soon, it would be too cold to play outside for long periods. The thought kept Maria awake at night. "Remember, Mrs. Patol will pick you up after school today," Maria reminded Elena as they approached the school gates. Mrs. Patol, who ran the corner market near their old apartment, had become an unexpected ally, offering to watch Elena some afternoons when Maria needed to catch the evening commuter crowd. "I know, Mama," Elena said with the patient tone of a child who's heard the same instructions many times. She hugged Maria tightly, her small arms barely reaching around her mother's waist. "Good luck with your songs today." After dropping Elena off, Maria stopped at a public bathroom to freshen up before heading to her regular spot near the financial district. She had tried different locations around the city before finding this corner where office workers passed by on their way to coffee breaks and lunch. The morning crowd was already forming when she arrived. Maria set up her small space, a cardboard sign reading "Music for Food and Shelter" propped against her open guitar case. She had debated whether to be honest about her situation or to simply present herself as a street performer. In the end, honesty had won out, though it still made her cheeks burn with shame some days. The first few songs always felt the hardest. Her fingers stiff from the morning chill, her voice not yet warmed up. But by the third song, something usually shifted. The music would take over, lifting her out of her circumstances and into a place where nothing existed except the melody and lyrics. Some days, she could almost forget why she was there. "Play the one about the river again," called a woman in a business suit who stopped by most mornings. Maria smiled and began the folk song her father had taught her about a river that persisted despite all obstacles. The woman dropped a $5 bill in the case and hurried on. By midday, Maria had collected nearly $30, not great, but not terrible either. She packed up briefly to find a public restroom and eat the half sandwich she'd saved from yesterday. Her feet throbbed, and her lower back ached from standing. She checked her phone, 3 hours until she needed to pick up Elena from Mrs. Patel. As she returned to her spot, a cold wind picked up, sending fallen leaves swirling across the pavement. Winter was coming faster than she'd hoped. Maria pulled her thin jacket tighter and began to play again, her fingers moving more stiffly now, her voice cutting through the wind. A passerby dropped coins into her case without stopping. "Thank you," Maria called out, though the person was already too far away to hear. "Thank you," she whispered again, to no one in particular, for every small kindness that helped them survive another day. "Here you go, love. It's getting too cold out there." Maria looked up to find Lisa, the barista from the coffee shop across the street, holding out a steaming cup. The unexpected kindness made her throat tighten. "Thank you," Maria said, accepting the coffee with grateful hands. 6 weeks of singing on this corner had turned strangers into something like friends. Lisa worked the morning shift and had started bringing Maria coffee about 3 weeks ago. "How's the little one doing?" Lisa asked, pulling her coat tighter as a gust of wind blew down the street. "Elena's good. She got an A on her math test," Maria said, pride momentarily pushing away her exhaustion. She didn't mention that Elena had been coughing all night, or that their motel room had a draft that no amount of stuffed towels could fix. The first snowflakes of the season began to fall as Lisa headed back to work. Maria sipped the hot coffee and plucked a few chords on her guitar, her fingers stiff with cold despite the fingerless gloves she'd found at a thrift store. The morning crowd had thinned, most people hurrying indoors to escape the weather. Maria had learned that snowy days could go either way, terrible for business or surprisingly good. Some people felt more generous when the weather turned, perhaps thinking about their own warm homes. Today seemed to be one of the good days. By lunchtime, Maria had collected nearly $50, more than her usual take. Maybe she could buy Elena some cough medicine on the way to pick her up. The thought lifted her spirits as she played a more upbeat song, her voice carrying over the noise of traffic. "You've got quite a voice there," said an older man walking by. He dropped a $10 bill in her guitar case. Maria recognized him as the owner of the hardware store 2 blocks down. They had never spoken before, but he'd nodded to her a few times. "Thank you, sir," Maria replied, not breaking her rhythm. "My grandson has a cold too," he said, pausing. "I hear it in your voice. My daughter swears by this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small jar. "Honey and lemon. Old family recipe with a secret ingredient. Works wonders." Maria was touched by the unexpected concern. "For your daughter," he added, as if sensing her hesitation about accepting more charity. "Elena will be grateful," Maria said truthfully. "Thank you." The man nodded and continued on his way. Maria carefully placed the jar in her backpack next to Elena's extra scarf and the small stuffed rabbit she'd managed to buy at a dollar store for her daughter's birthday 2 weeks ago. By 3 o'clock, the snow was falling steadily. Maria's feet were numb inside her worn boots, and her fingers could barely form chords anymore. It was time to pack up and get Elena from Mr. Choi, the elderly shopkeeper who sometimes watched her after school. As Maria was closing her guitar case, a woman with a baby strapped to her chest hurried over. Maria recognized her from the apartment building where they used to live. "Maria." "I've been looking everywhere for you since you left," the woman, Amara, said breathlessly. "Mr. Torres at the community center asked about you. They need someone to teach basic guitar to kids on Saturday mornings. It pays $25 an hour." Maria's heart leaped. Indoor work during the coldest part of the week would be a blessing. "He said to come by tomorrow morning if you're interested," Amara continued, bouncing slightly to soothe her fussing baby. "I've got to run, but I wanted to tell you as soon as I heard." "Thank you, Amara." "Thank you so much," Maria called as the woman hurried away. For the first time in weeks, Maria felt a glimmer of something beyond day-to-day survival. The walk to Mr. Troy's shop seemed shorter despite the snow. Maria found Elena sitting behind the counter, carefully sticking price labels on cans. "I'm helping," Elena announced proudly. "Mr. Choi says I'm the best helper." The old man smiled and waved away Maria's thanks. She is good company, and smart too. He slipped a paper bag into Elena's backpack when he thought Maria wasn't looking. Later, in their motel room, Maria discovered the bag contained warm socks for both of them and a container of homemade soup. Elena was already trying on her new socks, wiggling her toes in delight. As Maria heated the soup on their room's tiny microwave, she looked around at their cramped temporary home. Something had shifted. They were still struggling, still one emergency away from disaster, but they weren't alone anymore. Somehow, without intending to, they had built a small community around them, people who noticed, who cared. The motel room felt a little warmer that night, and not just because of the soup. Maria noticed him the first time on Monday. Tall, with silver-streaked dark hair and a long wool coat that looked expensive. He stood half a block away, just watching her perform. Not dancing or smiling like some listeners. Not walking past quickly like others. Just watching. When she finished her set, he walked away without leaving anything in her guitar case. "Weird guy," Lisa commented, bringing Maria her usual afternoon coffee. "He was here yesterday too, wasn't he?" Maria nodded, blowing on the hot drink. "Maybe he lives nearby," she said, but something about his focused attention made her uneasy. Tuesday brought heavy rain, driving most street performers indoors. Maria found shelter under the awning of a closed bookstore, where the building's alcove created a natural acoustic space. Her earnings would be lower today, but with the Saturday job at the community center now secure, she could afford one slow day. Through the curtain of rain, she spotted him again. Same coat, same distant position, same intense focus. This time, when their eyes met briefly, he gave a small nod before turning away. "Mama, is that man watching you?" Elena asked on Wednesday afternoon. School had let out early for teacher training, and Elena sat on their blanket doing homework while Maria performed. Maria followed her daughter's gaze and saw him again, this time leaning against a lamppost. 3 days in a row now. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. "Don't worry about him, Maja," she said, forcing a smile. "Some people just enjoy music." But when she started her next song, an old lullaby her grandmother had taught her, she noticed the man move a little closer, his expression changing almost imperceptibly. On Thursday, the wind was bitter, slicing through Maria's thin coat and making her fingers clumsy on the strings. Few people lingered to listen. Even Elena was staying with Mrs. Patel, where it was warm. Yet the stranger appeared again, wearing a scarf now but otherwise unchanged. 4 days straight, same time, same piercing attention. "If he bothers you, I can call my brother," offered Raj, who ran the newsstand nearby. "He's been watching you all week." "Thanks," Maria said, grateful for the offer but uncertain if she should be truly worried. The man had made no move to approach her, had said nothing threatening. Still, she packed up a little earlier than usual that day. Friday dawned clear and cold. Maria had her best spot ready, near the cafe where office workers lined up for lunch. She'd just finished a popular song that always earned good tips when she looked up and saw him again. This time, he was standing closer than ever before. Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. She looked around quickly, noting Raj at his newsstand and Lisa watching from the cafe window. She wasn't alone. Taking a deep breath, she launched into another song, pretending not to notice the man's approach. When the song ended, he stepped forward. Maria tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the pepper spray in her pocket, a gift from Mrs. Patel after hearing about the persistent watcher. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable," the man said, his voice surprisingly gentle with a slight accent she couldn't place. "I didn't know how to approach you." Up close, Maria could see he was older than she thought, probably in his 60s, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and pain. "Your voice," he continued when Maria remained silent. "It reminds me of someone I used to know. Someone important to me." There was such raw emotion in those few words that Maria found herself lowering her guard slightly. "You've been watching me for almost a week." "I know. Forgive me." He reached into his coat pocket slowly, causing Maria to step back. But he only pulled out a business card, crisp and white. "My name is Antonio Vega," he said, holding it out to her. "I used to work in the music industry." Maria hesitated, then took the card. On the front was just his name and a phone number. But when she turned it over, she found an address and time written in elegant handwriting. "What is this?" she asked, looking up at him. An invitation, a possibility. His eyes held hers steadily. "You have a rare gift. I'd like to discuss it with you properly, not here on the street." Before Maria could respond, he added, "Bring your daughter, of course. I understand your caution." With that, he placed a $100 bill in her guitar case, more than she sometimes made in 2 days, and walked away before she could even thank him or refuse the money. Maria stayed after him, the business card clutched in her hand, uncertainty and the faintest glimmer of hope battling within her. Maria stood outside the address on the card, holding Elena's hand tightly. The building was old but well maintained, tucked away on a side street in what had once been the city's arts district. A small brass plaque beside the door read Resonance Studios in simple lettering. "Is this where the man from the street works, Mama?" Elena asked, looking up at the building with curious eyes. "I think so, Maja." Maria hesitated, her hand on the door. Was she being foolish? She had texted the address to Lisa and Mrs. Patel, made them promise to call the police if they didn't hear from her in 2 hours. But still, walking into a stranger's studio felt risky. Her fingers touched the $100 bill in her pocket. That money had paid for a doctor's visit for Elena's cough, and still left enough for 3 nights at the motel. She owed it to her daughter to at least see what this Antonio Vega wanted. Taking a deep breath, Maria pushed open the door. Inside was a small reception area, empty except for a few chairs and faded music posters on the walls. Some showed performances from 20 or 30 years ago, artists Maria vaguely recognized from her father's record collection. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing slightly. A door at the back opened, and Antonio appeared, dressed more casually than she'd seen him on the street. "You came," he said, his voice revealing genuine surprise. "And this must be Elena. It's very nice to meet you." He crouched down to Elena's level, not too close, respecting her space. "Your mother has a very special voice. Did you know that?" Elena nodded solemnly. "She sings me to sleep every night, even when she's tired." Antonio's eyes crinkled at the corners. "She must love you very much." He straightened and gestured toward the open door. "Please come through. I've prepared some hot chocolate if you'd like some, Elena." The studio beyond was not what Maria had expected. Rather than the sleek, modern equipment she'd imagined, the space held vintage recording gear alongside newer technology. Instruments hung on the walls or stood on stands. Guitars, a violin, a small piano in the corner. It felt lived in, a working space rather than a showroom. "You actually record music here," Maria said, looking around with growing interest. Antonio nodded, pouring hot chocolate from a thermos into a mug for Elena. "For over 30 years. Not so much lately, but yes." He gestured to a small table where he'd set out some cookies alongside the drinks. "Please sit, be comfortable." As Elena happily sipped her hot chocolate, Maria finally asked the question that had been bothering her since their strange encounter. "Why were you watching me? What do you want?" Antonio sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "I was downtown for a doctor's appointment. I heard your voice from across the street. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It stopped me in my tracks. There's something in your tone, your phrasing. It's rare." "I'm just a factory worker who lost her job," Maria said quietly. "Not a professional. That's what makes it special. No auto-tune, no manufactured emotion. Just raw talent and genuine feeling." He leaned forward. "When was the last time you were truly happy singing, Maria? Not singing for survival, but for joy?" The question caught her off guard. "Before the factory closed, I guess. I used to sing at community gatherings sometimes. Church events." Antonio nodded as if she confirmed something. "I've been in this business a long time. I've worked with famous artists whose names everyone would recognize. But I've never recorded an album that felt real. Authentic, not until..." He stopped abruptly. "Until what?" Maria asked. Antonio stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down an old photo in a simple frame. He handed it to Maria. The picture showed a younger Antonio with his arm around a smiling young woman holding a guitar. "My daughter, Rosa. She had a voice like yours, natural, untrained, but perfect in its own way." Maria studied the photo, noticing the resemblance between father and daughter. "She's very beautiful. Does she sing professionally now?" A shadow passed over Antonio's face. "Rosa died 15 years ago. Car accident. She was 22. "I'm so sorry," Maria whispered, understanding now the pain she'd glimpsed in his eyes that first day. "After she died, I lost my passion for music. I kept the studio, but I stopped seeking new talent. Nothing sounded right anymore." He looked at her intently. "Until I heard you sing that folk song on the corner. The one about the river that keeps flowing no matter what stands in its way." Elena, who had been quietly eating cookies, looked up. "Mama sings that one to me when I'm sad." Antonio smiled at her gently before turning back to Maria. "I have a proposition for you. Not charity. A business opportunity. I want to record an album with you. Traditional songs, maybe some of your own if you write. I'll pay in advance that should help with your immediate needs, and if the album sells, there would be royalties." Maria stared at him, disbelief warring with desperate hope. Why would anyone buy an album recorded by a street singer? "Because authenticity is rare, and people are hungry for it." Antonio's voice grew passionate. "Your circumstances have given your voice something that can't be taught. True emotion, real struggle, genuine hope. That's what I heard on that street corner." He named a figure for the advance that made Maria's eyes widen. It would be enough for a security deposit on an apartment, maybe even a few months' rent. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or am I going to wake up back in that motel room?" Antonio smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. It's real, Maria. What do you say? Would you like to make music together? Not for survival this time, but for Rosa. For Elena. For yourself. Maria looked at her daughter, happily drinking hot chocolate in this warm studio, then back at Antonio with his offer that seemed too good to be true. Yet something in his eyes, that mix of pain and hope, told her this was genuine. When do we start? She asked. The first day in the studio was harder than Maria expected. Her voice, used to competing with street noise, felt too loud in the quiet room with its sound-absorbing panels. Every small mistake seemed magnified through the headphones Antonio had given her. I'm sorry, she said for the 5th time after stumbling over a lyric. Maybe this was a mistake. Antonio shook his head from behind the glass of the control room. Do you know how many takes it took Rosa to get through her first recording? 37. His voice came through clear on her headphones. This is normal, Maria. You're doing fine. Elena sat in a corner of the studio, drawing pictures and occasionally looking up to give her mother encouraging smiles. Antonio had set up a small area for her with art supplies and snacks, understanding that Maria couldn't afford childcare. Let's try again, Maria said, taking a deep breath. From the beginning. This time, she closed her eyes and imagined herself back on the street corner, singing for herself and Elena, not for a recording. Something shifted, and when she finished the song, she opened her eyes to see Antonio staring at her with an intensity that reminded her of those days he'd watched her from across the street. That's it, he said softly. That's exactly what I've been waiting for. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a routine. Maria would bring Elena to school, then head to the studio where Antonio would be waiting with coffee and ideas. They worked through a list of traditional songs Maria had grown up with, plus a few newer compositions that Antonio thought would showcase her voice. The advance had allowed Maria to rent a small but clean apartment near Elena's school. No more motel rooms, no more stuffing towels under doors to keep out drafts. Each night, as she tucked Elena into her own bed in her own room, Maria felt a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. You wrote this? Antonio asked one morning, holding up a crumpled paper Maria had forgotten was in her guitar case. It contained lyrics she'd scribbled down during her darkest days on the street. Maria felt her cheeks grow warm. It's nothing. Just some words that came to me one night when Elena was asleep. Antonio read the lyrics silently, then looked up. This is not nothing, Maria. This is poetry. He sat down beside her on the studio couch. Would you consider recording it? I don't have a melody, she said, embarrassed by his praise. But I think you do, he replied. I think you hear it in your head when you read these words. He was right. There was a tune that had formed alongside the lyrics, one she hummed to herself sometimes but had never fully developed. With gentle encouragement, Antonio coaxed it out of her, adding subtle piano accompaniment that enhanced without overwhelming her voice. As they worked, Antonio gradually shared more about Rosa, how she had dreamed of being a singer since childhood, how she had written dozens of songs by the time she was 20, how the record companies had wanted to change everything about her, her look, her sound, even her name. I pushed her too hard, he confessed one afternoon as they took a break. I was so determined to make her a star that I forgot to make sure she was happy. Maria watched him adjust a dial on the mixing board, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the tremor in his voice. The night of the accident, we had fought about her contract. She wanted to walk away from it all. I told her she was throwing away everything we'd worked for. He closed his eyes briefly. Those were the last words I ever said to her. Maria reached across the console and placed her hand over his. She knew you loved her. Did she? His voice was barely audible. After she died, I couldn't bear to be in the industry anymore. I kept the studio but turned away clients. My wife left. I just existed. He looked at Maria with those pain-filled eyes. Until I heard you sing. That day, they recorded Maria's original song in one take, a raw, emotional performance that needed no enhancement. When she finished, Antonio sat motionless behind the glass, tears streaming down his face. What will you call it? He asked finally. Maria thought for a moment. Second chances. The album took shape over the following weeks, a collection of 12 songs that told stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. Antonio brought in a few musician friends to add subtle accompaniment, a gentle guitar here, a violin there, never overpowering Maria's voice. "I want to call the album Street Corner Serenades," Antonio said as they listened to the final mix. "What do you think?" Maria smiled, remembering those cold days when music had been her only lifeline. "It's perfect." The night before they sent the album off for final production, Antonio handed Maria an envelope. Inside was a contract giving her full rights to her recordings and a generous royalty percentage, far more than industry standard. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Maria asked, overwhelmed by his generosity. Antonio was quiet for a long moment. "Because Rosa would have wanted her music to help someone else's dream survive," he said finally. "And because your voice brought music back into my life when I thought it was gone forever." As Maria signed the contract, she felt as though she was signing more than a business agreement. It was a promise to herself, to Elena, to Antonio, and to Rosa that their shared love of music would continue to heal and transform. 1 year later, Maria stood on a familiar street corner. The spring sun warmed her face as she looked up at the newly painted sign above the doorway, Harmony House Music School. Behind the large front windows, children sat with instruments of various sizes, their faces scrunched in concentration. "Nervous?" Antonio asked, coming to stand beside her. Maria smiled. "A little. This is bigger than anything I ever dreamed of." When Street Corner Serenades was released 6 months ago, neither of them had expected much. Antonio had connections with some independent radio stations who agreed to play a few tracks. A local newspaper ran a small story about the street singer turned recording artist. Then something unexpected happened. A popular podcast featured Maria's original song, Second Chances, in their closing credits. Listeners began asking about the singer with the hauntingly authentic voice. Streaming numbers climbed steadily. By Christmas, the album had developed what industry people called a cult following, not mainstream fame, but a dedicated audience that grew mostly by word of mouth. The royalties, combined with Antonio's guidance about investing the money wisely, had made Maria's newest dream possible. "It's almost time," Antonio reminded her, checking his watch. "The reporter will be here in 10 minutes." Maria nodded, smoothing her simple dress nervously. She was still getting used to people wanting to interview her. The door to Harmony House swung open and Elena raced out, followed by Mrs. Patel, who now worked as the school's office manager. "Mama, I helped Thomas with his finger positions just like you showed me," Elena said proudly. At 8 years old, she had taken to piano with natural talent that surprised everyone except Antonio. "That's wonderful, Maija," Maria said, straightening her daughter's slightly crooked glasses. "Are you ready to show everyone around?" Elena nodded enthusiastically. "I practiced what to say and everything." The idea for Harmony House had come to Maria during her first small performance tour. In every city, she saw children like Elena, full of potential but lacking opportunities. With Antonio's business expertise and her growing music connections, they had converted a struggling downtown bookstore into a place where children from all backgrounds could learn music for free. "The piano tuner just finished," Mrs. Patel said, checking items off her clipboard. "And the new violin teacher can start Monday." From inside, they could hear Lisa calling the children to attention. The former barista had surprisingly good teaching skills and now ran the beginner guitar classes 3 days a week. "I still can't believe we pulled this off," Maria said softly to Antonio as they watched more parents arriving for the grand opening. "Sometimes I think I'll wake up back in that motel room." Antonio shook his head. "This is very real, Maria. You made it happen." "We made it happen," she corrected him. "You and me and Rosa." Antonio's eyes misted slightly at the mention of his daughter. In his office at the school hung a photo of Rosa alongside pictures of the first group of Harmony House students. Sometimes Maria would find him there, looking at the photos with a mixture of sadness and peace. The reporter arrived exactly on time, a friendly woman who had covered Maria's story from the beginning. "Ready to show me around?" she asked after introductions. "Elena will be your guide," Maria said, resting her hands on her daughter's shoulders. "She knows every inch of this place." As Elena proudly led the reporter inside, explaining about the practice rooms and the scholarship program, Maria felt a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly brought her to tears. "You okay?" Antonio asked, noticing her expression. Better than okay, she replied, just thinking about how different things were a year ago. Standing on that corner, wondering how we'd make it through another week. Antonio nodded, understanding. Life can change in a moment. Sometimes it just takes one person to notice another. Through the windows, they could see Mr. Choi demonstrating a traditional string instrument to a group of fascinated children. In another corner, Raj's teenage son was helping younger kids learn to read music. The hardware store owner who had given Maria honey for her cold was installing shelves for sheet music storage. The community that had once helped Maria and Elena survive had expanded and transformed. Now they were all part of creating something larger than themselves. We should go in, Maria said. They'll be starting soon. Antonio held the door open for her. After you, Maestra. Maria smiled at the title she was still getting used to. As she stepped inside, the sounds enveloped her. Children laughing, pianos being practiced, the gentle chaos of beginners finding their way through scales. It was nothing like the polished performances she now gave in small venues across the country. It was messier, louder, full of mistakes and restarts. It was perfect. Later that afternoon, after the speeches and the ribbon cutting, after the local news had taken their footage and the last cookies had been eaten, Maria found herself alone in the main classroom. She sat at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys. She began to play the river song, the one she had been singing when Antonio first heard her on that cold street corner. As the familiar melody filled the room, she thought about all the currents and bends that had brought her here, to this moment. The door opened quietly, and Elena slipped in, followed by Antonio. Without a word, Elena sat beside her mother on the piano bench. Antonio leaned against the wall, listening. As Maria played the final notes, Elena looked up at her. "Are you going to sing on the street corner again, Mama?" Maria smiled, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "No, Major. I found where I belong." Antonio nodded in silent agreement, his eyes saying what words couldn't, that they had all found where they belonged, together in this unexpected harmony of second chances.